And let's move it forward to the interesting study by Plotkin and his colleagues on the topic by Brett Conter-Ross, Mano Henselmans, and the comparison between the squat and hip thrust. What is the practical application for this study?
Yeah, so Plotkin did a great job comparing two groups of untrained individuals performing either squats or barbell hip thrusts. And they looked at MRI, which is important because it's a really good measurement for the glutes, and ultrasound on the glutes is challenging to see changes just because of the technology and the architecture of the muscle. And they also looked at transfer to deadlifts, which is probably the most interesting finding for strength. So in addition to MRI of the glutes and transfer to the deadlift, they also measured MRI hypertrophy of the adductor as well as the quadriceps. So they did and the hamstring. So they did a very good job looking at the whole lower body. And the most interesting findings was that the glutes specifically had similar hypertrophy in both groups. And the squats produced more quadricep hypertrophy and more adductor hypertrophy. And then both of them had a similar transfer of strength to the deadlift.
امیر رضا یه لحظه من این توضیح بدم بعد شما اگه میشه توضیحاتو بدید. یکی از موضوعات مهمی که تو میجرمنت این مطالعه بوده این که با MRI گرفتن و اولتراساوند یا همون سونوگرافی ما چون محل موقعیت قرارگیری عضلات به طوری هستش که سخت میشه گرفت MRI یه پروتکل بهتریه نسبت به اولتراساوند. این خیلی مهمه. اینو حتما مد نظر داشته باشید. این نکته رو بعد میگفتم.
So one, I would say, misinterpretation of this study is that this suggests maybe the glutes don't respond as well to being trained at a longer muscle length because the squats train the glutes in a longer muscle length where the peak tension occurs in the bottom, while the hip thrust, the peak tension occurs at the top when the glutes are shortened. The reason why this is a misinterpretation, however, is these are two very different movements, and there could be other reasons why they produce different amounts of hypertrophy or different outcomes. And really, if we want to explore differences in lengthened versus shortened muscle groups for the glutes, we need to be comparing similar movements, like a partial squat versus a full squat, or a partial versus a full hip thrust, as an example. So the evidence overall that the glutes do respond to being trained at a longer position is pretty strong. In addition to the Kubo squat study, where deeper squats produced greater glute hypertrophy, there's also a conference abstract by Mao, where they found that using a glute isolation exercise called a multi-hip, training lengthened partials produced greater hypertrophy than full range of motion. So overall, the data does indicate that training at a long muscle length is probably better for the glutes, despite the findings of this study. The last thing to say is they also did a very cool comparison between EMG, where they used electrodes to measure the electrical activity in the muscles that were trained. And while EMG values were higher in the hip thrust group, the hypertrophy was the same. And this shows a consistent issue with the method, where we understand that while EMG can be useful, it doesn't necessarily predict hypertrophy and shouldn't be seen as a proxy for the stimulus potential of an exercise.